Before we start working on the wiring process, if there's any holes in your bird, now is a really good time to sew them up. This bird has a little hole right here along the side of the breast. We're going to go ahead and sew that up. We're just going to use a normal stitch over and under. You want to make sure that when you're sewing this back together that you line up your feather tracks correctly. You don't want to sew it the wrong way so you have like weird feather groupings. You can also sew up any holes like this when the bird's still wet in the water actually. Then these holes are kind of float back together and you can see the feather patterns. But this is a pretty simple spot to fix. So we'll just go ahead and sew this hole up. Put a couple of half knots here to secure the end. Snip off this little bit of excess. And then we'll just go over and under and sew this hole up. You want to make sure that you're not catching too many of the feather roots or the quill when you're sewing this, just so you don't have a bunch of bunching of the feathers. Just try to keep them out of it if you can. All right, so we've sewed that up. We'll just go ahead and tie it off. We'll just gently pull it tight, and we'll take our sewing needle and on the end of the string that we pulled out, make a couple of loops around the wire, and we'll just pull it tight. That's going to secure that in place. Don't over pull this because you'll pull your stitches out on a delicate wood duck. Just tight and cut off the excess. That was pretty much the only hole that we had to sew, so we'll start the wiring process. We're going to start with the wings. Now our one wing is going to be out because we want to see some of these colors displayed. So we're going to go ahead and wire that with a 16 gauge wing wire. And we'll sharpen one end of the wire. You can do this on a grinding wheel or with a wire snips. And we'll go ahead and insert this right inside the wing, running it down. Here's the own and the radius. We'll run it right through the rest and we'll come into this last little fleshy area in the wrist. We'll just embed it right in there until it doesn't go anymore. The wire is going to end about right here. We're going to pull it back out, not the wire, but we're going to invert the wing bones themselves. And what we want to do is we want to bend this wire along the ulna bone and come up to the humerus bone and bend it like this and then slightly bend it over. So this wire is going to be completely outlining the wing. We're going to attach this using some zip ties. And we're going to put one zip tie on the ulna and one zip tie on the humerus bone. Put another one up here on the humerus bone. And then you can either hand tighten these by pulling on them and then taking your wire snips and snipping them. Or if you have it, you can use a cable tie gun. That's going to lock these in tight. You want to be careful on some birds, especially like teal. If you use this cable tie gun, it's going to pull this so tight it's going to snap the bone. Right like that. Now, because I don't completely trust this cable tie to permanently attach this wire, I'm going to take some electrical tape and I'm going to wrap it the entire length of the humerus bone, right from the joint right down to where the humerus bone ends. That's just going to help hold this wire tightly to this bone. And that way, if the cable tie does break, the wire doesn't come loose and you don't get a floppy wing. We'll just cut the excess and we'll wrap that tight. Now we don't need all of this wire sticking out here. We only need enough wire to come through the form and then loop it back in slightly to secure the wing to the form. So we're gonna keep about roughly 6 inches, right like this, and just snip it off at an angle. The reason why we slightly sharpen this end is gonna make it easier to come through the form. Now what we will do is we will go ahead and wrap this wing right here with a little bit of cotton ball, or you can use fiber fluff, anything like that. This is just going to slightly rebuild the muscle tissue. You can kind of shape this around into a rough position. This doesn't have to be exact. You're really not going to see it too much because most of this wing is going to be tucked up anyways. And then what you can do to secure that to it is you can take some string and we'll tie it around the base of the humerus bone. And then we will actually wrap this string around to secure this cotton to the wing. And in different areas you can pull tighter to start to manipulate and shape that muscle texture. And again, it's not super crucial to do that on this pose because this is just a standing mount and you're never going to see it. It's not like a flying pose where there's a chance somebody might start, grabbing around on that area, or you need it to look a little bit nicer. Just enough to secure it and lock it in place. Then we'll do a couple of half loops. Go ahead and do another one. This is just going to secure the string to that, and we'll cut off the excess. Now this area down here on the radius and ulna bone area, we're going to go ahead and put some liquid nails in there. That's going to rebuild that muscle detail, and it's going to give our secondary something to seat or bed into so they dry nicely in a uniform shape. So we'll go ahead and we'll push the wing back in. And we'll take some of our liquid nails and we'll just squirt a small amount inside of that whole cavity area, just enough to rebuild the muscle tissue that we had removed earlier. Just injecting a small amount. You don't need very much, just a little bit. We'll go ahead and reseat this wing and we'll just gently push the liquid nails so it kind of completely fills up that cavity. That's going to give some of our secondary feathers to sit into nicely. And at this time, because it's a standing pose, we can go ahead and slightly start to bend this wing in, this wrist area, just to kind of start to tuck it in. We'll do more a little bit later on. But this is about what we're looking at right here. As you can see, we have to do quite a bit of grooming yet on the feathers, but we're starting to get into a general shape. Now on this side of the wing, this is going to be tucked into the side pocket. Now depending on the method that you use, you can either keep the humerus bone on or remove it. In our case, we're going to remove it because we don't need it. We're just going to be pinning the wing into place. So we can just discard the humerus bone, pull the wing back out. We will put in a very small amount of liquid nails just to rebuild the muscle tissue that we removed from the ulna and radius bone area. Go ahead and smooth that in. You don't want a big lump of it. You don't want too much in there so that you start to get sag from the weight of the adhesive that we put in. And then what we'll do is when it comes time to tuck the wing in, we'll just fold it in and pin it right in place. We won't be using any wires on this side. Now we're going to be wiring the legs up two different ways because there's one leg is going to be tucked up and the other leg is going to be supporting the bird. So we're going to use a 12 gauge wire to support the bird. And we're going to run that through this foot because this side is going to have the wing out and the leg tucked up. Normally when I wire a standing wood duck, I'll use a 14 gauge wire and run it through this part of the pad. But because it's going to be supporting the whole weight of the bird, and this is a slightly thicker wire, we're going to run it right through the bottom pad of itself, right where the shank connects to the foot, right here. If we run it through the toe, there's a strong chance that we might start breaking these bones in here because this wire is so heavy. So we'll go ahead and we'll sharpen one end of this. You can either use a grinder or your wire snips. And we will run this right up through the bottom of the foot pad, right here. Run it right up the shank. We want to come all the way through, coming underneath the skin. We want to travel under the skin, and we want to come up under the skin right along the leg bone itself. So now that we've pushed through this joint area, we'll go ahead and we'll push the leg bone out, and you can start to see our wire coming through. We'll push it up till we've got about a half an inch or so, 3/4 of an inch of wire sticking out, and we'll go ahead and we'll attach the wire to the leg bone with the electrical tape. We're going to run it along the entire length of the bone. We'll just cut that tape off. I see we have a little bit of a tendon hanging here. I'm just going to snip that off at this time. Now we are going to rebuild the muscle tissue on this particular leg because it is going to be visible. So we'll just take a small amount of cotton, unravel it like this, and we'll just wrap it around this leg. You don't need very much. We're not even going to use this whole cotton ball. Just a very small amount just to rebuild that muscle tissue slightly and blend everything in nicely. Crimp that in, and we'll once again go ahead and wrap that with some string. We'll tie it off at the base. Cut off this little bit of excess. And then we'll just wrap this right around this leg just to hold that cotton. Because what's going to happen as we're running this wire up into the form, this cotton could pull off. That's why we're fastening it down. And we're going to fasten a little bit tighter. We're going to wrap it tighter down here to start to, so it blends in nicely to how the foot naturally is. Because if you remember, during the skinning process, the bulk of the meat was up here, and down here was pretty much just some tendons holding it together. So that's wrapped securely. So we'll just go ahead and make a couple of half loops. And we'll just secure this right to the leg. Go ahead and do one more just to lock it in. Right like that. And we'll snip that excess string off, and we'll move on to the other leg. Now we're going to move on to the foot that we're going to have tucked up inside. So we're going to use a 16 gauge wire on this. We don't want to use anything too heavy because we want to make sure we have a lot of mobility here. So we're going to sharpen this end. And I am going to run this wire right through this pad right here, this toe area. It does have kind of a big scarring here. So this foot's idea to tuck up and start to hide. I'm not sure. This looks like it was an infection at one time, probably from being shot at some point. So we're going to go ahead and run this wire right up there. Run it right up the shank. Come right underneath, right through this joint. And we're going to come underneath the skin, run the wire along the leg bone, just like on the other leg. Push the wire through and leave about a ½ inch to an inch of wire exposed. We're going to secure this with electrical tape. We just want to make sure that this does not move around during the mounting process. Keep that wire nice and tight on there. We're not going to rebuild this leg, this muscle detail. It's not necessary, it's going to be hidden, and I don't want anything to interfere with us tucking it up in. So this leg is done. So now that we have all the wings wired, this wing set, the humerus bone's gone, the legs are wired, we got the 12 gauge on this side, the 16 on this side, we can go ahead and start to insert the body into the bird. So we're going to start by doing this wing, and we're going to line this wing up. On some forms, they have little marks where they want you to put the wires in. You can kind of eyeball it on this side because we ground that out to make room for the humerus ball joint. So we're going to come right in that rough area, going to come right up through, right out the side, or the belly area of the bird. And as we start to run this wire down, I want to start inserting my neck. I'm going to start to pull the neck, artificial necking, right up into the neck area. I'm going to balance the bird's body right here. This is just going to give me some support as I push this necking through. If you remember, we looped that wire around, so that way we don't have to worry about it coming out and sticking through the skin and making unnecessary holes for potential caulking to slip out of. You can take your finger and run it inside the bird's neck and just kind of help manipulate the skin down. There is quite a few bends in this neck, so it makes it a little bit trickier to get the necking in. We're going to run it to about right there. You can see the artificial necking came through. We have a little bit of corn cob, a little bit of borax. Go ahead and knock that off and brush that aside. You don't want that to get on the feathers. And now that that's been inserted through, we'll go ahead and continue pushing our wing all the way up. So right here, we've just connected to the form. We want to make sure that this humerus bone is in tight, pressed tightly against the form. If you have a lot of excess wire sticking out here, you can go ahead and remove some of it. This is an except, we'll go ahead and cut a little bit off. Keeping a good amount of pressure, pulling back towards me to keep this wing joint attached to the form. We're going to start to loop this around and push it into the form and pound it over. Now this stayed tight to the form. It's important that that stays tight. If it doesn't, your wing is going to sit back too far. So that's sitting nice and tight. We'll go ahead and start to pull this skin around the breast. We don't have to wire this side because there's nothing to wire. Start to insert the body in. And at this point, we can start to attach the legs to the form. Now again, on some forms, they give you little marks where they want you to put the legs in. I've found on these Farabee forms that I like to go about 1/4 inch in front of where they tell you to put it. That's just my personal preference. So I'll go ahead and grab a little Sharpie marker. So instead of the hole being right here, we're going to put it right here, just about 1/4 inch ahead of where they want you to put it. I just find that the legs sit a little bit nicer that way. So we can go ahead and insert this leg wire in. We are going to run it right into that little mark that I put on the form. And we're just going to run this wire all the way through the body and come out the other side. I'm going to make a little loop in the wire here just to give me some holding power. We just came out. I'm going to put in a little bit more. And bend this around. And then we're going to loop it back in. We're going to make a loop. We're going to pull it tight, securely tighten to the form. If you don't secure this in tight, your leg is going to be wobbly. You want a nice solid mount. Now we'll come through and we'll butt this leg back up to the form, right like that. We'll make a slight bend. That's going to secure this wire in and keep it from moving around. At this point, because this leg is going to be tucked up, it's not going to be used at all for the standing procedure, we can go ahead and snip it off right here. We no longer need it. If this was going to be a supporting leg, we'd want to keep this wire attached. Just make sure that our foot covers that wire, right like that. Now we'll do the other side. Again, we'll follow the same procedure. We're going to come in about 1/4 inch in front of the hole that they want you to use. And we're just going to push the wire in. And we're going to come through the form and come out the other side. The same procedure as last time. Sometimes if your wire gets stuck, if you wrap your tape a little too tight, you can go ahead and slightly twist the wire like this, and that's just going to loosen it up a little bit. We're going to pull the leg down slightly just to give us some room to run this wire through. Do that again. Basically, we're just kind of feeding the wire up along the leg. There, we just popped out. So we'll go ahead and pull a little bit more through. We want to make sure that this one's looped around really good because this is the only wire that's holding the bird up. So we want a pretty good sized loop on this to sink back into the form. Go ahead and loop this wire around. I'm going to push a little bit more through. And then you want to make sure that you don't catch the other side feathers when you're pulling this through. We're just going to bring her down. Start to push this leg back so you don't get too much. So it's kind of a balancing act between pulling the wire through on this side and feeding the leg back up along the wire. If you get too much leg out, there's a chance that you might start ripping the skin. At this point, you can either keep pulling or you could pound this wire in the rest of the way. We're going to go ahead and just knock this wire in quickly. You want to make sure that when you're doing this, you don't hit on these feathers and start damaging them. Just pound that wire into place. And then on this side, we'll go ahead and seat this leg bone, again, right up to the form. We're going to butt it right against it. And then we're going to bend it over, right like that to lock it in. Now we're going to keep all this wire on here for right now. We obviously are not going to need it, but we're going to keep it on just in case we do. We're just going to need enough to go through our final attachment piece of driftwood. Now what we want to do is start to feed this tail down onto the form. We're going to go ahead and seat this into the tail slot. We're starting to get a pretty good buildup of borax on the table. We'll go ahead and wipe this off just to keep it off of the feathers. All right, so the tail is now roughly in the tail slot that we cut into the form. And at this time, we're going to take some of our liquid nails and we're going to inject it into the tail slot. And then we're going to seat the tail into those liquid nails in the tail slot. And we're going to anchor that tail with a 1-inch pin so it doesn't move around during the rest of the mounting process. So now we're going to take some of our liquid nails and we're going to carefully inject it into the tail slot area. Now, if you didn't want to do that at this point, I recommend doing it at this point, but if you prefer to do it later on, after we have the bird sewed up and up on our mounting apparatus, you can come through and inject your caulking in through the oil gland area. You remember that feather that we removed? There's a little hole there now, and you can easily inject this in there as well. But I like to get this tail injected and locked in place before I even start sewing it up. Go ahead and gently put this bird back down. We're going to slightly part these feathers just enough so we can get the tip of our liquid nails inside of that tail slot. And we're just going to squirt in enough liquid nails to fill the slot up. You want to make sure that you don't start getting liquid nails all over the feathers. It's very hard to get off. So we're going to be careful and just inject enough to fill that slot. And then we're going to right away pull it out. Sometimes these like to continue to squirt out like this thing is here, and that can drop onto your feathers. Now what I like to do is grab onto the form, grab a hold of the tail, and we're going to push the tail right into the tail slot. We're going to get all those feather butts and feather quills right in there. We're going to take our 1-inch pin, and we're going to pull up on the vent, and we're going to take our 1-inch pin and push it right through the vent area, that thick vent skin, and lock the tail in place, right like that. 1-inch pin in, push it in place. This tail has now been immobilized. It's locked inside of the tail slot. It can't be flopping around on you. If we wouldn't have locked it with this pin, this tail would be drooping way down, and you'd have adhesive all over the place, so you want to lock it in nice and tight. As you can start to see, the bird is starting to shape up. We've got the tail locked in, we've got the wing out. This wood duck has very beautiful colors. I was a little bit concerned. It is a Wisconsin bird. It's a relatively earlier season bird. Sometimes on wood ducks, these would be a lot goldener, but this is still a beautiful bird. It's going to make a great mount. This is probably mostly what you're going to be taking in is about this quality level of bird, a very good quality, not exceptional, but very nice. It's going to make a beautiful mount. Now that we have the tail locked in, we are going to take some of our cotton batting and we're going to push it right where the crop was. So right in this area right here, we're going to put a little bit of this cotton ball and just put it right in place, right like that. Now we're going to start the sewing procedure on the bird. Now we're going to take some sewing string. This is just regular sewing string you can buy at any supply company. You don't want to use string that's too thick. This is a really good, strong, durable string. And we're just going to need enough string to roughly sew up this seam. Always make sure you have a little bit of excess. Just snip it right off. And we will attach it to our needle. I believe this is a number 2 Glover's needle. Just do a couple of half knots on it. And we will start sewing up the bird. So we'll come right to where we started our breast incision, and we'll run the needle and thread through. And we'll tie this off with a couple of half knots. Now you want to make sure during this tie-off process and throughout the rest of the process that you don't catch a lot of feathers in your seam. Otherwise, you're going to have an uneven seam that you can see. You want to make sure that you're just getting the skin, not the feathers themselves in your stitch. You can see we have that tied off. You can also see, if you zoom in, all the under or downy feathering. It's very important at this stage that this is very dry and that it's, as you can see, we did a good job cleaning it. It's nice and fluffy. If this was all ratty and it had a lot of grease or blood in it, you wouldn't get a very nice mount. But because this is all nice and fluffy, thoroughly fleshed, and very properly washed, it's going to make a nice, fluffy, full-looking bird mount. So we'll just start sewing up with a normal stitch, just a standard baseball stitch. And we'll go on one side, and then we'll come to the next. And then we'll repeat that process as we work down the seam. Being careful that we don't catch any feathers in our incision. as we're sewing up. All right, so we've sewn up about 3/4 of the seam. And all that I've been doing is just gently pulling it as I've been going. We still have to do about the last inch of the seam here yet. I'm just going to finish this up. I'm not overly pulling too tight at this point. This is always a delicate area to sew down here by this whole vent region. The skin's real thin. It's easy to rip out these stitches. If that does happen, you can either try stitching a little bit deeper, or you're probably going to have to start pinning the skin in place itself versus sewing, which is not ideal at all. But if it does start to rip on you, you can use a pin here to realign the skin and pin it in place. All right, so we've sewed up the entire seam. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab onto the string with my right hand. I'm going to hold on to the string right against the skin, and I'm going to pull this seam. What that's going to do is that's going to start to pull all this loose skin up here. It's really important, especially on a real fatty bird that has a lot of loose skin, that you pull this tight, and that's going to start to draw in all that loose skin. Just like that. That's about as tight as we want to pull it. Now right now the seam looks terrible. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a wire and we're going to back brush this seam. So we're going to go against the grain of the feathers, just like this. That's going to start to realign all of those feathers. And while we back brush it, we're keeping tension on the seam. Otherwise, if you don't keep tension on the seam, and if you do this, you're going to loosen all those stitches right back up again, and you have to start over with your pulling sequence. Now we're going to take my other hand and I'm going to start to groom these feathers into place. Smooth everything out. Wood ducks are real smooth and streamlined. All ducks are. And now you can start taking a tweezers if you want and playing with your seam a little bit. If you have a little spot that doesn't look 100% perfect, you can start to groom some feathers over it. But this seam turned out really nice. I'm not going to tie off my seam, and the reason why I'm not going to tie it off is throughout the drying process, I want to be able to manipulate this seam by pulling on it some more, especially if this was a super fatty bird. I want to be able to come through here and just pull these stitches and move this skin around. This bird did not have a lot of excess fat, so it fits really nicely on the form. If we were starting to have a bunch of loose skin everywhere down here and throughout this whole area, we could start taking 1-inch pins and pinning this skin in place now that everything's all tightened up. Otherwise, what might happen is during the rest of the process, some of it might start to fall. But this looks really good. And I do want to mention on that you don't want to necessarily overpin either. You wouldn't want to start pushing a bunch of pins in this area because you're not going to be able to manipulate your side pockets. So just like a pin or two down in this region is fine to lock everything in place, but it's not needed in this case. You can literally sit here for almost an hour and just fuss with this seam, getting everything perfect. But this is really nice. You can't even see where we sewed it up. So we can go ahead now and start to manipulate the legs in the position that we want them to be in. So we'll start with the worst leg first, and that's going to be this one with the 12 gauge wire sticking out of it. We'll go ahead and bend it onto the form, and we're going to start to bend it in. And this is where reference is going to really start to help. Because if on a bird that's balancing himself, not only is the leg bent in, but it's also bent in different directions. So we'll go ahead right like this, and we're going to bend this leg slightly forward. How they would naturally look, roughly about like this. We'll finish positioning this when we have it up on the stand and on our finished base to get the exact pose. But right now we have it pretty much roughed in place how we want it. You can see it's kind of slightly angled in to balance the bird. Move it ahead just a little bit more because it is balancing its entire weight on that leg. And we'll finish that a little bit more. On this leg, we'll start to repeat that process. We will bend it back and start to bend it up. We're not going to tuck it all the way in yet at this point, but we will just tuck it in enough just to kind of rough it into place, because we will have to inject these legs in a little bit. From here, I'd recommend blowing your bird off with some compressed air just to remove some of this excess dust from the borax and the mounting process, and just to kind of help to start to seat the feathers.